Opening the king's diagonal immediately creates attacking possibilities and claims central space. Instantly establishing central pawn presence, black mirrors white's bold territorial claim, setting the stage for a classic pawn duel. Developing the knight to a central outpost now pressures black's pawn, initiating typical opening skirmishes for initiative. Developing this knight to a natural square defends the pawn and prepares for further piece activity. Opening the Ruy-Lopez, this bishop targets the knight, preparing central pawn advances and indirect pressure on black's king. Challenging the bishop's position, this pawn advance forces white to decide on the bishop's fate, potentially opening lines for black's queenside. Maintaining pressure on the bishop prevents it from becoming a passive piece and keeps open lines for potential future attacks. Initiating a counterattack on white's center, this developing maneuver challenges the knight and prepares kingside castling. Securing the monarch initiates a phase where white can concentrate on central development and pawn structure, while black must address the immediate threats to their knight. Boldly seizing central space, black challenges white's knight and opens lines, creating immediate tactical fireworks. Opening the d-file injects immediate central tension, forcing black to confront the threat to their knight and potentially opening lines for white's pieces. Black boldly pushes, challenging the bishop and seeking space on the queenside, but this aggressive pawn advance creates weaknesses behind it and allows white to seize central control. Retreating the bishop to b3 offers a safe haven for the piece while maintaining influence over the d5 square and preparing to support a potential c4 advance, solidifying white's central control and discouraging black's ambitions on the queenside. Boldly striking at the center, black challenges white's central pawn structure and opens lines for development, a crucial response to the Spanish. Initiating a central pawn exchange frees up diagonals and opens lines for your pieces, potentially leading to a more dynamic middle game. Observe how this simplification impacts the pawn structure and the available squares for both sides' knights. Consider the newfound pressure on the c6 knight and the implications for piece mobility in the coming exchanges. Solidifying the pawn structure, black repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, eyeing the central squares and preparing for further development while simultaneously defending the weakened kingside. Suddenly, the queen electrifies the center, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and challenge the bishop's influence on the long diagonal. An audacious foray, this knight boldly ventures to the center, eyeing the vulnerable white king and challenging control of the d5 square with newfound influence. Opening the d-file now aims to activate the rook and pressure black's central pawn structure, potentially leading to a more dynamic middle game where white can exploit open lines. Boldly snatching space on the queenside, this pawn's aggressive advance disrupts white's bishop's positional anchor, simultaneously creating a potential outpost for black's knight while forcing a reevaluation of the king's safety down the d-file. Developing the bishop to this square immediately addresses black's recent pawn thrust, aiming to regain central influence and prepare for potential counterplay. Sacrificing a pawn for immediate piece activity and to disrupt white's pawn structure creates a dynamic game. The doubled b-pawns could become a weakness later if black cannot generate enough play on the queenside. Unlocking the semi-open, a file for immediate pressure on black's queenside structure. This capture creates a significant imbalance in piece activity while simultaneously solidifying white's central pawn presence. Repositioning the queen to c8 opens up the c-file for potential pressure and shields the king from any immediate diagonal threats from the bishop on b3, while also preparing to connect the rooks. Unlocking the d-file with tempo creates immediate central pressure, forcing black to react to the encroaching queen and bishop battery. Black disrupts the pawn structure, forcing a decision and opening the queen's diagonal. Opening the b-file for your rook now significantly increases its activity, potentially creating pressure along the half-open path towards black's queenside. Reinforcing the central pawn chain and preparing to castle, black solidifies its position while keeping lines of retreat open for the queen. Targeting black's defensive structure, this repositioning of the bishop directly confronts the pinned knight, threatening a severe disruption of black's pawn formation and potentially opening lines towards the king. A crucial strategic decision is made, prioritizing the safety of the monarch by tucking it away behind pawn fortifications, a move that solidifies the king's position for the upcoming middle game struggle while potentially delaying active counterplay. Shifting the queen to this central square initiates a dynamic repositioning, aiming to leverage the newly opened b-file for potential pressure and simultaneously eye the weakened d5 pawn, creating an interesting duality of threats. A surprising retreat, this queen redeployment seems to prioritize avoiding the potential fork on e7, but it cedes significant central influence and leaves the queenside somewhat exposed to white's impending pawn push. Initiating development of the knight to its most active square, this maneuver aims to contest central influence and prepare for potential forward advances on the kingside, while simultaneously reinforcing pieces that might come under pressure. A surprising pawn thrust, 17. a5 immediately challenges white's queenside pawn structure and aims to disrupt the harmony of the white pieces, potentially opening avenues for counterplay on the queenside or creating a passed pawn. Exchanging the bishop for the knight untangles white's queenside and begins to exert pressure on the now isolated pawn, fundamentally altering the structural balance of the position. The knight's relocation to e7 seeks to consolidate the bishop's sacrifice on g5 and establish a more resilient defensive structure, albeit at the cost of ceding some dynamic potential. This maneuver allows the remaining pieces to coordinate more effectively around the center and potentially prepare for a queenside expansion, while simultaneously clearing the way for the rook to potentially access the d-file later. Observe how the pawn structure now dictates a passive defense for black, a common consequence after trading off central initiative for positional solidity. A bold recentralization, the knight abandons its earlier defensive post to immediately contest the critical d4 square, aiming to disrupt black's pawn chain and potentially open lines towards the king. Black launches a bold pawn thrust, aiming to disrupt white's queenside structure and create weaknesses around the exposed b3 pawn. This aggressive pawn push fundamentally alters the pawn dynamics, potentially opening lines for black's pieces or forcing white into a defensive posture. It's a dynamic choice that sacrifices immediate pawn center control for active counterplay on the flank, a thematic struggle in many Spanish openings. Reclaiming central influence, white's knight embarks on an aggressive circuit towards the queenside, disrupting black's developing harmony and preparing to exploit the a-file's open status. Reasserting central control with the queen, this maneuver aims to challenge white's advanced knight and prepare for a potential queenside expansion, while simultaneously keeping an eye on white's slightly exposed king. The repositioning of the queen to e3 unlocks the d-file for potential rooks and aims to prepare for pawn advances on the kingside, while simultaneously keeping an eye on the central squares and indirectly supporting any future kingside expansion. Shifting the queen to b7 aims to create potential threats along the queenside, perhaps by leveraging the open file and preparing further pawn advances or piece activation, while simultaneously defending the b4 pawn and avoiding immediate tactical complications. Unleashing a calculated raid, white's queen repositions to a square that simultaneously eyes the queenside pawn structure and supports a potential kingside advance, aiming to disrupt black's pawn chain and exploit the open central files that have emerged. Activating the knight to c6 prepares to contest central control and potentially exploit the semi-open c-file that arises if white chooses to advance on the queenside further, while also creating a more solid structure against any immediate queenside threats. Solidifying the central pawn structure, this move prepares to contest the d5 square and offers a potential escape square for the king should the queenside become too active. Unlocking potential for a kingside pawn advance, perhaps to f5 or f6, creating an attacking avenue. This offers white a more robust pawn phalanx, aiming to limit black's queenside space and potentially create a passed pawn on the kingside later. A cautious commitment, it avoids immediate tactical fireworks and instead focuses on building a stable, balanced position for the middle game. This move indirectly supports the knight on d4, adding a layer of defense and solidifying white's central presence. Bf5 cleverly repositions the bishop, contesting the crucial diagonal and aiming to liberate the queenside pawns, potentially forcing white into defensive maneuvers and creating tactical opportunities by indirectly pressuring the knight on d4. Rerouting the knight to f1 initiates a subtle but significant maneuver, aiming to shore up the kingside defenses while preparing for potential advances on the queenside. This seemingly passive repositioning is actually a strategic gambit to improve the knight's scope, bypassing the congested center and looking to reintegrate through g3 or h2 for better activity. It sacrifices immediate central influence for long-term piece coordination, a hallmark of patient positional play. The goal is to create a more harmonious structure, enabling the kingside pawns to advance or providing a more secure perch for the king if the queenside conflict escalates. Seizing the initiative with a pawn thrust, Black boldly aims to disrupt white's pawn structure on the queenside, creating potential weaknesses and opening lines for their pieces. This aggressive push may force white into defensive maneuvers, sacrificing material or positional advantages to maintain their kingside safety. Opening the b-file, a bold decision, finally confronts the queenside pawn structure after a lengthy maneuvering phase, potentially unlocking white's attacking possibilities against black's castled king. A daring pawn thrust aims to shatter white's pawn structure and create immediate counterplay on the queenside, potentially opening lines for black's pieces. Opening up the d-file with this redeployment of the rook aims to put pressure on black's queenside pawn structure, specifically targeting the advanced passed pawn on b3 and potentially creating opportunities for breakthroughs or piece infiltration later. Unlocking the d-file immediately asserts influence, aiming to disrupt white's centralized pieces and potentially create complications along the semi-open file, preparing for future pawn advances or rook infiltrations. A clever maneuver aims to dislodge black's well-placed pieces, seeking to activate white's dormant rook. The bishop finds a spectacular outpost on c2, immediately disrupting white's coordinated pieces and aiming directly at the now vulnerable queenside pawns. Reclaiming the central d-file after black's bold pawn thrust offers white a crucial foothold, potentially igniting counterplay on an otherwise blocked board. The queen repositions, seeking active squares and perhaps aiming to exploit the open b-file, while white's pieces are somewhat congested and preparing for a central pawn advance. Releasing the queens simplifies the position, potentially heading towards an endgame where the pawn structure on the queenside becomes a significant consideration. Reclaiming the captured pawn, black solidifies their pawn chain and opens the c-file for potential future piece activity, a crucial step as the game transitions towards a more open, possibly tactical middle game. Re-establishing central influence becomes paramount after that exchange, aiming to prepare for potential pawn advances. The bishop repositions to its most active diagonal, eyeing the queenside majority and preparing for a potential advance or exchange that could unravel white's pawn structure. Reasserting pressure along the second rank, this maneuver aims to dislodge the disruptive bishop and begin consolidating white's position. The intention is to initiate a campaign to recover lost pawn structure and perhaps create an outpost for the knight on d4 should the opportunity arise. Seeking active squares for the knight, this maneuver injects potential tactical complexity into the queenside, probing for weaknesses while preparing to reorient towards the kingside if white's defenses allow, potentially creating dynamic interplay around the exposed c2 pawn. This maneuver immediately aims to cramp black's queenside development, forcing their knight on a5 into a passive defensive role and simultaneously threatening to penetrate the weakened c-file. Diverting the queen's pressure to a more active square frees up crucial space on the queenside, preparing a potential advance that could disrupt white's solidified pawn structure and potentially open lines for black's rooks, forcing white to reconsider their rigid formation and perhaps defend against encroaching threats. The rook's journey to the d-file aims to initiate a centralized attack, potentially targeting weaknesses on the queenside or preparing for a pawn push. Unleashing the bishop to c4 rips open the queenside, aiming to dismantle white's pawn structure and potentially exploit the newly created weaknesses on the b-file, fundamentally altering the positional landscape of the game. Harnessing the diagonal power, White initiates a dynamic reshuffle, aiming to unravel Black's solidified pawn chain by liberating the knight from its confined square. Securing the d3 square with the knight opens up the possibility of its advancement, potentially targeting weakened pawns or creating new attacking vectors, while simultaneously unblocking the bishop's diagonal and allowing for future queenside expansion. The rook's repositioning to the third rank dramatically asserts control over the open file, simultaneously threatening to infiltrate Black's queenside pawn structure and exploit the isolated b-pawn. This maneuver forces Black to carefully consider defensive allocations, as White's cavalry now has a clearer path to participate in the coming skirmishes. Seizing the open file with the rook immediately pressures White's isolated pawn on a3, a critical structural weakness. Unpinning the rook from the e-file opens up avenues for queenside pressure by forcing a recapture, potentially exposing weaknesses in Black's pawn structure as the queens are now off the board. Suddenly, the knight re-enters the fray, challenging the queen's pawn and creating a dynamic pawn confrontation on the queenside that could unravel White's slightly constricted position. Securing the advanced passed pawn is paramount as the exchange on the file signals an endgame where pawn structure dictates the outcome. A surprising resurgence of activity from the knight, seeking to exploit the newly opened central files and potentially disrupt White's coordination, though it leaves a potential weakness on the queen side. The rook's redeployment to the 7th rank initiates a decisive endgame squeeze, aiming to exploit the open lines and the isolated pawn on c2. Focusing on the newly opened file, Black's rook now eyes potential entry points on the 7th rank, hinting at a shift towards aggressive play on the queen side and potentially threatening the isolated pawn. The king's safety is paramount, and bringing this monarch towards the center from its once exposed position offers a crucial defensive fortification. The knight's journey back to the queenside aims to disrupt White's consolidated queenside pawn majority and potentially exploit weaknesses, though it relinquishes the strong outpost it occupied. The king's centralizing journey begins, aiming to engage in the endgame's skirmishes and potentially secure remaining pawns. Fortifying the king's position with g6 prepares to activate the rook on the h-file and potentially launch a counterattack, addressing the current cramped situation for Black's pieces. Securing the open file offers a vital tempo to reorganize the rooks, potentially forcing a favorable exchange. The knight's royal sally forces the white king into an exposed position, potentially opening lines for Black's rooks and bishops while disrupting White's pawn structure. The monarch ventures into the fray, a bold maneuver that sacrifices the safety of the central squares for an active role in the ensuing skirmish. White now aims to utilize the discovered threats and pressure the weak pawns, potentially forcing concessions and simplifying into a more favorable endgame scenario. A desperate gambit, sacrificing material to unearth the opposing king, hoping the chaos offers a sliver of counterplay. The king boldly steps forward, no longer content with a passive role, daring to confront the opposing knight and create immediate tactical complications. A desperate attempt to force a perpetual check, hoping the white king can't escape the perpetual pursuit. The monarch finally retreats, seeking a safer haven after a series of checks. The black knight's relocation to c3 re-establishes a nagging outpost, forcing white to consider its removal or risk it becoming a permanent thorn in their side, as it disrupts the pawn structure and potentially limits white's mobility on the queen side. Gaining space on the king side now, aiming to potentially activate the g-pawn or open a path for the king. Expanding the kingside presence, this pawn push aims to create a potential passed pawn on the h-file and disrupt white's defensive setup, opening avenues for black's remaining pieces to become more active. Re-establishing the king's presence in the center allows for potential pawn support and greater mobility, a prudent step as the queens have been exchanged, ushering in an endgame phase where king activity becomes paramount. The knight's journey to the queenside aims to improve its scope, potentially targeting the isolated pawn and offering support for future advancements, though it sacrifices direct engagement in the center for now. The king abandons its safe haven, stepping into the fray to claim central dominion. The knight's journey to c5 seeks to unburden the queenside pawns, eyeing their advance and potentially setting up a squeeze on the white king's position by infiltrating along the third rank. Capturing the pawn opens up the b-file, giving white a clear path to attack black's queenside structure. This pawn push significantly reduces the escape squares for white's monarch, creating a subtle but potent threat of tactical complications. Initiating activity on the kingside becomes the immediate priority, aiming to create a new pathway for your monarch to engage in the latter stages of the game. Unleashing a rook to the 7th rank is a bold maneuver, attempting to disrupt white's pawn structure and introduce immediate threats along that open file. Disrupting the knight's defensive patrol on f7 offers a fresh tactical pathway by forcing black to react to an immediate threat on their king's security. Suddenly, the king finds himself exposed to a surprising check, disrupting white's carefully constructed defense and forcing an immediate reaction from the monarch. Sacrificing the knight to open up the g-file and expose the black king is a desperate, albeit theoretically sound, attempt to salvage something from a lost position. The king finally escapes the immediate danger, but a deeply exposed monarch in the endgame is a ticking time bomb. Seizing the open file, the rook forces the opposing king into an awkward corner, preventing any immediate counterplay and preparing to exploit the weakened pawn structure. Finally, the king ventures out from his safe haven, aiming to rejoin the fight. Seizing the initiative with a bold pawn thrust, white aims to create unstoppable threats on the kingside and force a decisive outcome in this tense endgame. The king finds a brief moment of respite by forcing the rook to the side, but the underlying danger of white's unleashed pawn remains palpable. This check, while immediate, doesn't fundamentally alter black's precarious positional standing against the encroaching white pawn. Embracing the open file, the king steps forward, a bold sortie into enemy territory, aiming to disrupt black's pawn majority and create counterplay by exploiting the slightly exposed dark squares around the black king.